Hello everyone, today we talk about the importance of Peter Abelard from the birth of logic to the origins of scholastics. We often discuss scholastic not much merely from a philosophical point of view, which we will have to make up for at some point. But we often forget that the seat of such great systematization of Western thinking in the Middle Ages had its roots deep into the very intense philosophical development of the 12th century. Actually, there are some, the repetition of scholastics, didactically speaking, sometimes ambiguous to some. The golden age of scholastics is not the 13th but 12th, but actually, this is accurate if you, let's say, realize in fact what the roots of the 13th century accomplishments in the 12th century were. Europe was undergoing actually a crisis, not much of a not just at least a growth, but also a very complicated transformation that required new solutions for the entire system to be settled, which is what will in fact eventually happen this century afterwards. And so the reasons of this, as we've seen many times, is the combination of the renewed exchanges with the rich and cultured Eastern world, let's say elan, the push determined by city life, the birth of universities, the new community reforms, new political theories that definitely brought Europeans sometimes to live shoulder to shoulder in a way they had never been used right before this great rise, especially of urbanization, and especially the interdependence that existed between these centers and the great public authorities like the kingdoms as were being formed. Naturally, also the empire at this point having some shots in accomplishing its universalistic Euro-Mediterranean dream, I would say, and this of course highlighted also the contradictions of this system. Right, we addressed many times for example, the immediate difficulty that posed from a moral point of view, the enormous treasury of new riches, of new income that was incompatible in many ways with the previous Christian sensitivity relation with money, and this went along also with however, from the other side, a greater confidence in mankind, in humanity proper. The same relation towards God changed, right, and not always in a merely harmonic sense, because, for example, the studying of the scriptures, coupled by a renewed interest towards nature, science, cosmology, fields that were up to this point still considered profane and of secondary importance, if not even dangerous. And this trend was particularly evident among the scholars of the Cathedral School of Chartres, about which we made a video actually, and that a school that was inspired technically by the Neoplatonic tradition that up to this point had been the dominant one, right, since St. Augustine in Western Europe, but that had as its fundamental characteristics this intellectual commitment and interest for everything that was new. And this is in fact the same century of the spread of Aristotle, right, and this in fact more rationalistic and scientific approach to nature, and also new logical dialectical methods that reacted quite effervescently, let's say, with the existing ones in Europe. As you realize, these were two very different systems of values that had also been modified along the way, right? These were not Plato or Aristotle, right? There were elaborations, other, let's say Neoplatonic or Aristotelian influenced works sometimes, And that presented two alternatives that were obviously conflictual and required a settlement. That, however, giving the axis of balance at this point was still much more shifted towards Neoplatonism and mysticism that were being central still in the majority of Christian speculations in Europe at this point. The school of Chartres, however, didn't eliminate nor substituted the cult for the ancient auctoritates per se, right? Yet was pretty alive the sensation that science in modern people could surpass the one of the ancients. Not because it was better, but because it was not condemned by the repetition, say, of the comment, and it was instead capable of widening and deepening the matter through criticism, right? Hence the famous saying, "We are dwarfs on the shoulders of giants," which means not just that obviously the old masters had been enormous, gigantic figures, but that starting from their work, you could, even from your own modern limitation, being able to look far beyond them, right? And this is an important perception because it naturally shows how already by this time, and technically throughout all the early Middle Ages in previous centuries, Western civilization had never lost absolutely the perception that there had been a before, that the ancient world had been productive, not just in a many people think that the Middle Ages, people just thought the ancient world was a magical world where certain incredible things happened, that literally giants had built, I don't know, the Roman ruins or things like this. But I mean, there is no limit to fantasy and to ignorance in this regard. But the point is that the elites, people who studied, who accessed, an education, knew, of course, that there was even that past was enormous, and that you could study it, you could learn about it, but also that you could now even be able to do better. So definitely not the vision, an obscurantistic vision, or a vision of darkness, of an age that instead was quite bright. It was coming out, in this sense, intellectually speaking, from a moment of more safe reliance just on the authority, and now beginning to experiment an original thought on its own. So basically a new science was rising to the rank of key of knowledge itself, right? And this was logic, right? Logic taught the fundaments of knowledge in itself, not of knowledge in itself, but rather the method with which knowledge had to be dealt with, right? And differently from the older method based on the literal comment of the Bible or the ancient authors, at this point were instead researched certain criteria act to understand, besides faith, that is through the help of the sole human reason, that what was just or what is not, right? And you realize that this was a very morally unscrupulous way of posing the matter, because one question was, interpreting creation through a method that could illustrate fundamentally what were the functionments that laid at the base of it. But another thing was simply saying, can we do this without redemption, without a medium, right, through sheer reason, as definitely a divine gift, but also what was known naturally still today for Christian doctrine, the insufficient, right, unsatisfactory for achieving salvation. So there are huge philosophical implications here that we can't deal with. But let's say that at the base of such renewal, right, and not just a methodological one, but also more properly intellectual, there was the work, in fact, of Peter Abelard. Pierre Abelard was a priest that taught in Paris, and that among his works wrote his famous Sic et Non, that is a manual of logic in which he taught how to organize rationally the intellectual choices by opposing an argument to another one. Abelard is a great figure of the massive influence that he gave in the spread of philosophical and scientific knowledge. He conquered these masses of pupils even when he was basically ostracized, and literally opening schools in a field, and that covered themselves with tens and tens of students that wanted to learn his teaching, coming from everywhere, right? And this stemmed from his exceptional ability in mastering logic, dialectic, right? And with this critical acumen with which he analyzed the Bible and the fathers of the church, right? And he's mostly famous, naturally, for his also clash with Bernard of Clairvaux, right? That even accused him of being an heretic, and objectively, many of his thoughts were so unscrupulous, let's say, so free, so devoid of prejudice, if you want, that he didn't realize even sometimes when he stepped into a quite heterodox thinking that resembled pretty much heresies that had already been typical. Look at Pelagianism, Nestorianism, even Arianism, right? And definitely, especially his opinions on Trinity were placed actually outside of the doctrine of the Catholic Church, so much that they were eventually condemned at the councils of Soissons and of Saint. And he had a devastating life for many reasons. He was persecuted by his opponents, but as you know, he is also perhaps most famous in absolute terms for his love story with Heloise, right? And this relation is considered by many as the first documented example of love declined in a sort of modern key, right? Like with this absolute and reciprocal passion and devotion. And he had intellectually many collectors, right, of his legacy. Arnold from Brescia, we made a bit about him, famous heretic, eventually was burned at the stake by Frederick Barbarossa. John of Salisbury, that was the secretary of the Archbishop Thomas Becket. Otto Freisingen, who was the great man of letters and uncle of Frederick Barbarossa. Also, Rolando Bandinelli, that was the future Pope Alexander III, right? And he's, the first source on his life is the Historia Mearum Calamitatum. That is basically the story of my misfortunes, as we will see now, he suffered just pretty heavy psychophysical traumas during his life, and which is basically an autobiography written in the form of letter to a friend, with probably an intent to publish it, right? And then we can add definitely the letters between him and Heloise, and that were also meant to circulate among the friends of Abelard. And his main work was written in 1130, in 5 or 6 years, and then there are other minor sources. If you look at the letter of Rochelain of Compiègne, that was first his master, and as we will see eventually also his opponent. Rochelain was in the dispute of universals was extreme nominalist, right? And he basically denied the the Trinity, as distinguishing fundamentally the three persons of the Trinity as three separated ones, not just as part of one own. Abelard himself criticized this view, but he took part of it fundamentally in the form of modalism that was criticized by Bernard of Clairvaux and other important scholars that also sometimes even helped him after his disgrace, during his disgrace. And yet he was, in the Dispute about Universals, he was fundamentally a moderate realist after all, but he just went too far in other fields, where there is a letter of Fulk of Deuil, the Disputatio of Guillaume of Saint-Thierry, also the Chronicle of Otto Freisingen, and the same letters of Bernard of Clairvaux, and some allusions also in the writings of John of Salisbury. And Abelard, as you understand here, was at this point during his life adversed by the traditionalists, right? And yet he had this enormous, he procured his own times. Most of his logic would be actually taught in half a century later as the official one in the universities. Also, Gratian from Camaldoli wrote his collection of canonic law, famously the Decretum, using the Abelardian method in logic that was at the base of that very scholastic system that renewed theology and philosophy in Christianity. Abelard was born at Payet, close to Nantes, so he came from Bretagne in 1079. Think about the years here, right? It's not just anecdotal. This is a world that is really taking shape in this very moment, right? And these figures are crucial to even shift the balance, to give a different address, right? Let's say the Latinization of the Brittonic village in which he was born brought to him the name of Petrus Palatinus, the way he is also sometimes still called. And he was son basically of a lord of his village, and he was destined initially to the military career. He would become a knight, but he preferred actually to study, to pursue the intellectual path, and therefore an ecclesiastical career, a secular ecclesiastical career, let's say better, which was the only one that at that point could allow it to study. So Abelard studied actually in several cities in France, but among which there are Tours, then Loches, and he had as his master, he hit the greatest nominalist philosopher of his time, as we've seen before. That was Rosselin. That he was eventually, condemned, attacked. That letter we mentioned before is actually a very angry and even vulgar one. It's a very strong language, accusing the same Abelard of, being a betrayer, of insulting, being an immoral person as such. And nominalism started basically from a Stoic background, right? It was developed especially since the 11th century, and that eventually would be brought to its apogee by William of Ockham, that we will see on another occasion. After this, Abelard transferred himself to Paris itself, that, as you know, was rising as one of the greatest cities of culture in the Western world, and especially for the theological studies. And that's here that he had as his master Guillaume of Champeaux. But he didn't, miss, the opportunity to enter in contrast even with him, right? Abelard is depicted as this very arrogant, vain, ambitious man, right? At the beginning, especially of his life, he was very sure of himself, and and his intelligence definitely, allowed him to behave in this way. Also considering the fortune the fame that he enjoyed because of his philosophical thinking, but this naturally created a lot of enemies to him. And he was, however, genuinely disappointed by the teaching of his masters, towards which he legitimately felt superior, and he was reciprocated with hatred. And therefore, he began to open schools on his own, right? First at Milan, then at Courbeil. But in 1114, when he was around 35, he came back to Paris, where he started to teach in the school that is located over the mountain of Sainte-Genevieve, right? This small hill south of Paris that is the one that would become actually the seat of the city university that is in fact, hosting at its feet the Sorbonne today. So this is really the foundation of those traditions in many ways. And the novelty and the boldness of Abelard's methods and ideas made of him a sort of free and unscrupulous, as we have seen, intellectual symbol. And it's within this charm and charisma that is situated the love story with Heloise. Right? It was young and intelligent girl that had been entrusted to him so that he could teach her philosophy. Now, Heloise was the niece of a cathedral canon, Fulbert, right? It was also important in his own regard as a thinker, among by whom Abelard himself had taken abode, right? And very soon, from the fame of the passion that broke out between Abelard and Heloise equaled the one of the intellectual value of Abelard himself. And Abelard and Heloise even had a son that was named, and this is a very meaningful example, not with the name of a saint from the Christian calendar, but the one from an astronomical instrument, right? The astrolabe. They called their son Astrolabe, and the choice of this name is really emblematic of this atmosphere of cultural and sensual exaltation, and even radicalism, if you want, in which Abelard and Heloise were living in those years. So it was a strong contrast between the establishment and this reality of the schools, of the theological schools, that they found to be unbearable in a way, right? This is important because it stems from a scientific interest, and we can't say these people were like free thinkers in the way we do today. As always, they weren't necessarily the just even the extremists that certainly of their positions, especially in the fields of heterodoxy, seems to suggest. But it's quite meaningful that they dared to challenge now, quite dangerously and with pretty heavy consequences, as we will see, what they deemed as untrue from a Christian standpoint, and yet also something that made them exceed from the other side. And however, in between 1119 to 1120, Abelard and Heloise also got married in secret. The situation, though, given especially the gravidence of Heloise, the birth of this child could not be tolerated from Heloise's family, right? And her uncle got revenge with his actually military relatives, as we have to also context this socially and politically. These were scholars coming from the elite, like the families of these teachers were, coming from the nobility sometimes, and however they lived also in a militarized lifestyle. So actually, Abelard was kidnapped and cruelly eviscerated. Yeah, Abelard got castrated as a punishment, and eventually he was forced to embrace the monastic condition, right? And without, however, finding peace, not even in it, right? But on the contrary, actually, to deal with multiple situations in which he was opposed even by his own monasteries, when he even carried out the functions of abbot. At some point he was even almost poisoned to death by his monks. Another time they even hired a killer for dispensing of him, and all this in a situation in which his intellectual activity had not ceased. Right, he had suffered this brutal trauma and separation from the saeculum, and physical violence, and you can imagine the frustration and the rage, etc. But he didn't give up as a thinker, and on the contrary, probably the part of his his pride was reinforced in this sense, as a counter revenge, right? And there are we could talk about this relation also between Abelard and Heloise from a broader philosophical standpoint. We could start actually a series on history of medieval philosophy, because even if at this point, as you understand, their love couldn't be an earthly one anymore, but it could continue in God, right? So the reference still to the to this intellectual engagement and this proximity and vicinity and love that had not died out, that continued in religion and even in the atonement, naturally, of their sins. And even in these letters, some of which are actually of great artistical quality and sincere mystical elan, there is the trace of the older passion, right? Naturally, now transmutated. However, it was not Abelard's relation with Heloise that was, by the way, suspended, but rather, in fact, for his ideas that his activity as a master brought Abelard to be persecuted by also one of the greatest figures, definitely the greatest mystic of the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux. We made a video about him, about architectural aesthetics. We'll have to discuss him more extensively at some point. But he was instead, from the side, rather, of the tradition, of the mystical experience, of the idea that, reason alone cannot achieve salvation, that there is a sensual, the importance of beauty, of vision, right? Think about the role of the Virgin. Also, in fact, the one of architecture, as we've seen in that video, in presenting a superiority that is greater than word, right? Behind the Neoplatonic tradition, the Pseudo-Dionysus, etc., here in 12th century France, there is all the birth of Gothic, right? Gothic meant as a great symbol of the universe that is not expressed through human tongue, but through mathematics, through music, right? It's the musica from St. Augustine that actually, not even Vitruvius, that built the Gothic cathedrals as such. And this naturally was reflected in the light, in the vision, in this harmony that could basically touch the inner chords of the spirit, and that passed therefore through other means that were comprehensible for everybody, right? Abelard in this sense stands also in a dangerous place, because it was trying to make sense of of theology through, in fact, an overconfidence of reason, and effectively eliminating the sensual dimension of the story, which is kind of paradox, right? Because Bernard of Clairvaux was so stern and and chaste, and that and criticizing Abelard, but actually stressing a sensual theory, whereas Abelard was, as we've seen, a sensual man, in love with Heloise, and therefore loving feelings in this regard, but stressing instead a rational view of the world, intellectually speaking. So this is a very interesting. Bernard of Clairvaux was, I suppose, he is, for those time standards, even fair. He contacted him privately and told him, look, if you don't, retract with your positions, I will denounce you. And the clash went on between the two. Bernard considered Abelard's view as venom, right, of philosophy that basically weakened the basis of the faith, foundation of the faith. And the interesting thing of this is that Abelard himself actually stressed repeatedly his Christian orthodoxy, right? So he didn't think to be critical of Catholicism per se, and of Christianity for that matter in general. Yet he was condemned at the Council of Sens in 1141. He died. He spent his last months of his life actually hosted by one of his criticizers, that, however, had been kind of moved by his disgrace, Peter the Venerable, right? That actually hosted him in his monastery. He died. Abelard died in 1142. In misery and desperation at this point, because he had appealed, by the way, when he was condemned, actually in the previous, at the Lateran Council as well in 39, then because he had previously appealed to the Pope, right, and Innocent II actually, heard his case and condemned it even further, and his pain was mitigated. He was not, this is also interesting. For example, Roscelin had already been condemned, but he retracted at the end, and he wasn't condemned as an heretic. Not even Abelard himself made it end, right? But he was humiliated. Now, at some point, he was even, forced to perform certain, to recitate the Athanasian Creed. He was humiliated for his, what was even as his excessive, intellectual vanity and boldness, right? And this is a huge deal, because naturally, we could study. Trying to study the psychology of these characters from the sources is very, very difficult. But we can understand also what these terms really meant of the time and the vision of the world and of creation that stood behind them, right? So it was not just a matter of attitude, but really the topics that were being touched, and the also the lack in this regard of a control by the authorities. This is the point of this century, is also in many ways the lack of a complete control of the ecclesiastical hierarchies over the doctrines that were spreading in this time. The 12th century is the great center of heresies that literally threatened to overwhelm the Western Christendom at this point. It is a crucial turn point, and there is definitely a vision behind even the triumph of Orthodoxy in this sense, that was able, however, thanks exactly to figures like Abelard, paradoxically, to eventually embrace Aristotelianism, as we will see later, that the Scholastic of the 13th century owed much in its logical and dialectical method to the same Abelard, right? So there is definitely a world that here is in crisis, right? And is in order to save itself, must take the next step that at this point is seen as too bold, right? And definitely passed through mistakes. From the same Abelard, as we were saying before, actually stemmed the thoughts even the one of Arnold of Brescia, for example, and of other heretics and other heretical or heterodox movements, right? And those were the same ones that were threatening the establishment per se, and sometimes intermingling even with the same universal powers, right? Because think about the clash between the papacy and the empire, the role that Arnold of Brescia had, even with the rebellion of Rome to the pontiff, and and the contingencies in imperial politics that even brought him to be killed, actually, while Barbarossa had formerly even let him do in order to weaken the papacy. So a moment in which really the world was perceived to go to be going in ruin in many ways. Also, we know a few about these characters after all. I mean, they're very famous in history, in philosophy, but we know relatively few about their work, right? And Abelard, by the way, had this very scrupulous, especially as we understood, relation between reason and revelation, right? That is between sciences and theology. So sciences including philosophy per se, right? And he was censored for this very reason. As thinkers, mystical theologians like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, tended to put reason aside in favor of the contemplation of a static vision, right? But you do not build, a stable world simply through mystics, right? You need much greater substance. You need a rationalization, even the courage of a minimal secularization in the field of knowledge, or at least something that is able to integrate what seems apparently to be new and different into the same Christian theology, right? Definitely Abelard was tended more to think that reason helped faith rather than faith helping reason, right? Especially his motto in Latin was nil credendum nisi prius intellectum. That is, you basically don't have to believe in anything until you haven't understood it. And this is fascinating because actually, if you look even at things like baptism in the early days, even Jesus himself, people got baptized when they were old, when they were mature enough to understand, not where they were newborn babies, and this entailed naturally a commitment. So here there was even an important point of saying, okay, but what is about our Christian commitment for real, right? He was also, however, this was probably Abelard's problem. He was, even phraseologically speaking, kind of bold, right? He adopted an attitude and a way of posing towards the sacred subjects with a kind of a definitely not a very humble way, right? Bernard of Clairvaux said when he spoke of Trinity, he sounds like Arius. When he speaks of grace, he sounds like Pelagius, right? Because he thought there is this very interesting view of his that stressed the fact that Christ, it also was reflected in his Trinitary view, but that Christ basically was a revealer of grace, right? And not a medium through which obtain it, right? This was Pelagianism, right? The idea that, in fact, you can achieve salvation in spite of the original sin, right? The sin of your ancestors. This was inconceivable, right? Because Abelard thought that it took simply to understand something to be able to get it, right? And this sounds much also paradoxically like Gnosticism in some ways, because it meant that in order to understand something, to get saved, you have to understand first, not to believe, right? To have faith. This is conceivable. Also, when he spoke, just to finish Bernard of Clairvaux quote, when he spoke of Christ, he sounds like Nestorius, right? And that would be other to say. Other visions were more balanced, like on the dispute on universals, right? And he, for what concerns ethics, he was substantially subjectivist, at least in appearance, right? And yet he was very subtle in this regard, because he thought that for example, the idea of sin through thinking, it only happens when the thinking eventually is followed by sin proper, right? You can have this, think about his love with Heloise and sin in that regard. He thought that nature had built humans with natural needs that cannot be eliminated, right? And the sin occurs not if you have that need, but rather if you, let your mind giving way to it with action, right? So you can't, thinking about something wrong is not a sin unless it transforms itself in such. This is a very interesting thinking, even relatively to scholastics, because you see, the scholastics must give a rational, secular order even to what needs to be done, not much in a formalistic way, but at least assessing, like in Aristotle's ethics, a balance, right? So that there can't be a Neoplatonic, in part the two things were mixed eventually in Christian thinking, and naturally mysticism remained quite intensely. It cannot be eliminated as a path of spiritual life. But the idea is that we must make a world work now on the base of new, let's say, legitimate ethics that can be regularized, can be controlled, right? It doesn't make a trial to intentions, but do what you actually do, which is a better civilized thing, very rationally ordered world that doesn't take away, in this sense, the due to the spiritual dimension, right? And therefore, there is not, of course, he's crypto or maybe pseudo Pelagianism, I don't know, too, and he was against asceticism as basically a useless attack to human nature as such. To try to stem the human nature. Well, what really is needed in that regard is developing your rational control on it, so that you can eventually address yourself in a more easy way. Because if what society was all ascetic, it would be impossible, because people would simply do something else. But I think this is a very important, let's say, step on the path of civilization, and the fact that this idea, this rationalism, survived, lived on, is particularly important. Abelard is therefore, without any doubt, one of the fundamental figures, not just of the 12th century intellectual world, but of all Western culture, right? His love for Heloise, as we've seen, was not just an episode, right? He and his beloved have, if you want, invented love as we conceive it in modern terms, like at this complete, absolute, let's say, passion and devotion of two human beings, one for the other. Furthermore, his autobiography, his Historia Mearum, either Calamitatum or Tribulationum, which means basically the same thing, of his misfortunes, of his disgrace, can also be considered as a modern autobiography, right? At least one of the modern autobiographies, even as a literary genre. And among his many, today we didn't talk about them much, but works, theological and logical works, are definitely important, as especially the latter one of logic have brought him to be called the masters of Western logic. As we have seen in the Sic et Non, he showed how human reason can achieve important results without necessarily the support of the sacred scriptures, and has elaborated the principal fundaments of identity and of non-contradiction, therefore contributing to the birth of the proper scholastic philosophy of the 13th century. And this is in fact the point, looking at his legacy, right? If you look at Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus, they all applicated the logical scientific method to the study of revelation, right? Think about the importance of this revelation as actually as a mediated but still non-reason, not necessarily however not entirely rational message, right? There is a rationale in the revelation for sure. If anything, it's a written word, for example. But as we know, and as the same Catholic Church, the same Scholastic stated, that is not enough as a rationale, but it requires way more. But the forms here, right, and therefore also theology encompassing science can be inquired with the instruments of human intelligence, that is reason, right? And consider in this regard what the Latin scientia actually means, that is knowledge itself. And logos in Greek as as God, as is translated in Latin, it's been translated into verbum, so stressing properly the word of it. But the logos naturally in Greek means also word, but has also a broader semantic meaning, is also reason per se, and knowledge in part, right? So the concept of the logic, divine logic as knowledge, the idea that if we were omniscient, we would be able to draw in rational terms the world as it is, and this is what only God can do, right? But humans can partake this in part in their limited environment. This is a concept that you find importantly expressed even much later Western philosophy. Look at rationalism with Descartes, that believed that to a certain extent humanity could know, right, and that God was pure reason. Or Kant, that says that humanity per se, that there is a noumenos that cannot be known behind it, the essence of reality, but there is something we can't scientifically know, and there are certain boundaries in the knowledge of reality, but within these boundaries we can achieve a real knowledge. This is what our scientific revolution in the 17th, 18th century actually stems from, right? And these were concepts that were pioneered by Scholastic back in the day, to found that very base that Western civilization had maintained through the centuries. So Scholastic, the triumph of the universalistic Christian vision of the world, is founded on reason. It's founded on Aristotle, right? Not on Plato as a cosmological view. That the Christian science speaks Aristotle, right? Or at least Avicenna, writing Aristotle, rewriting Aristotle, and this is important because Platonism, as it is not a band, right? There is always that component. Western civilization does emerge from Plato and Aristotle, but once again, the Aristotelic and Ptolemaic system remains for centuries at this point the official Christian scientific system of reference, right? And it starts from Abelard's logic as such. And if we think in fact about Saint Thomas Aquinas, 1221, 1274, he had initially studied at the faculty of the arts in Naples for eventually entering in the Dominican order, and after a journey in Cologne, he went to Paris, where he began his university career dedicated to the theological studies. And besides the influence of the Abelardian logical method mediated through especially his master Thomas, that is actually Albertus Magnus, and as clearly visible, for example, in the construction of the Summa Theologiae, right, in which he arrives to the solution of the question through the studying of the favorable propositions, videtur quod sic, and the contrary once sed contra, right. In the formation, also the same Thomas Aquinas philosophy had a great weight, the Latin translations, of course, of Aristotle and of the Arab philosophers, and in particular Averroes, that had spread from this quite conflictual, actually polemical, ferocious, as we have seen even with Abelard's castration, French, now academic world, right, largely an ecclesiastical environment, where these ideas had been brought on the fore, and this clash had taken place, this contrast taken place. We would have not had Scholastic in our civilization if there hadn't been a brutal, ferocious struggle to avoid, actually, Aristotle at the beginning to be incorporated in Christianity. Aristotle was forbidden at the beginning by the Catholic Church to be studied. At one point, this couldn't be done anymore, and also thanks to figures like Abelard that kept, kept searching for this stuff, kept explaining it and trying to find new solutions, so much that that reason triumphed, and the greatness of Christian civilization was to acknowledge this and say, okay, now we take Aristotle and we integrate it in our we actually use it as our scientific system by adapting it to the scriptures, and which also fits pretty well, right, as a vision of the world. After centuries in which Western world, Latin Germanic Europe had fundamentally addressed chiefly a different patient, the one also of a different humanity. Right, a humanity that had mostly to fear God's punishment, to research this mostly sensual contact with the world, but not daring to try to let's say to scope it, to research it, and to go out. These people have the courage to go out there, and they do it also with a renewed vision of humanity. And to tell it all, to be in all honesty, also the Neoplatonism, Platonism had made this, the Platonic scholars, put in this way, the mystics, had favored this kind of renewed sense of confidence, even in the positivity of different systems of references, right? For example, the rise, the centrality of the female figure, right, in our art, Christian art, in Christian sensitivity, in new forms, in fact, of the stress properly the humanity of the Christian message. So it's actually I hope it didn't sound too much rationalistic. Maybe this is what was criticized of Abelard himself, is that you can't settle on a purely rationalistic base in order to live a righteous life. Not just through the Christian teaching, but properly, right? It's impossible, even we know it, that today, from a scientific, biological point of view, let's say, but still, this was a big step that needed to be done, right? Because rationale is the expression of civilization as such, and yet it takes a toll, it takes a price even, right? And Abelard's life was definitely the exemplification of this sacrifice, this very high price to pay. For this person was persecuted, ostracized for all his life, and suffering a lot, as you understand, but still leaving a legacy without which we wouldn't be the civilization that we are today. All right, so for today we stop it here. We will talk about Abelard, of course, in Heloise, in other contexts as well, and I'm thinking of various other videos we could do in the future, but let's take it just as an introduction to Abelard's figure, right, and that eventually we'll expand on in other videos. So for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.